The sanctions were supposed to slow China down. Instead, China imported more chip-making equipment in 2023 than at any point in its modern history. Not from one country, from several, through routes that barely existed 5 years ago. Malaysia's semiconductor exports to China surged. Vietnam quietly became a packaging hub. The UAE started appearing in trade records connected to restricted technologies. Kazakhstan showed up in logistics chains nobody had talked about before. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Washington was still publicly talking about Taiwan as if the entire semiconductor future lived on one island. It doesn't. That's the part people are only beginning to absorb. Because the global chip industry isn't just about who can manufacture the most advanced processor. It's about who controls the chain around it. Chemicals, assembly, substrates, testing, rare earth refinement, industrial gases, mature node production, lithography maintenance, back-end packaging. Thousands of invisible dependencies. And while headlines stayed locked on TSMC and Taiwan Strait military exercises, China spent the last few years doing something much quieter. It started building redundancy. Not full independence. That's different. More realistic, too. And the strange thing is that Beijing never really hid this strategy. The agreements were public. Customs data was public. Ministry statements were public. Most people just ignored them because none of the countries sounded dramatic enough for cable news. Malaysia isn't emotionally satisfying geopolitics. Neither is Uzbekistan. But supply chains don't care about drama. They care about friction. A chip doesn't need ideology to move across a border. It just needs paperwork. In October 2022, the United States imposed sweeping export controls designed to restrict China's access to advanced semiconductor technology. The Bureau of Industry and Security targeted high-end AI chips, advanced lithography tools, and the ability of Chinese firms to scale beyond certain process nodes. On paper, this was one of the most aggressive technology containment strategies attempted in decades. The logic made sense. Cut China off from the most advanced tools, slow military modernization, slow AI development, force dependency on Western-controlled systems. Reasonable theory. Then reality arrived. SMIC, China's largest semiconductor foundry, continued advancing its N+2 process technology. Huawei returned with a 7-nanometer smartphone processor inside the Mate 60 Pro in 2023. Chinese imports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment reached roughly $40 billion that same year, according to Chinese customs figures. Not despite sanctions, during them. Washington released another report. China released another phone. There's a dry sort of comedy buried in that sequence. But this story isn't really about whether sanctions worked or failed. That's too simplistic. The United States absolutely made China's technological climb more expensive and slower. ASML's EUV lithography restrictions mattered. NVIDIA's AI chip controls mattered. Dutch and Japanese coordination mattered. What Washington underestimated was China's willingness to redesign the map itself. Not technologically at first, commercially. See, people imagine supply chains as pipelines. They're not. They're ecosystems. Push too hard in one place and the system reroutes itself through another. Sometimes legally, sometimes ambiguously. Sometimes through countries that suddenly discover they have a very strategic geography. Take Malaysia. For years, it was viewed mainly as a lower-profile semiconductor assembly and testing center. Important, but secondary. Then demand exploded. Chinese firms increased partnerships. Western companies simultaneously diversified production there to reduce exposure to China itself. And suddenly, Malaysia became something unusual, a meeting point where both sides of the technological Cold War needed the same factories. That matters more than it sounds, because once 7 or 8 countries become economically tied to keeping semiconductor trade flowing with China, containment stops being a purely American decision. It becomes a negotiation with countries whose economies increasingly depend on staying connected to both sides simultaneously. And that's where the Taiwan obsession starts becoming dangerous analytically. Because while everyone was staring at the potential battlefield, China was building the fallback system behind it. We'll come back to the number 7 later. It matters more than the headlines did. The easiest mistake to make here is assuming these 7 countries signed some dramatic anti-American semiconductor alliance behind closed doors. They didn't. That's what makes this effective. Most of the agreements were commercial, technical, logistical, or industrial development partnerships that looked completely ordinary in isolation. A refinery expansion here, a packaging facility there, a bilateral customs agreement nobody outside trade ministries read. But once you stack them together, a pattern appears. And patterns matter more than press releases. Start with Malaysia and Singapore. By 2024, Malaysia handled roughly 13% of global chip packaging, assembly, and testing activity. That sounds secondary until you remember something important. The most advanced chip in the world is useless if it can't be packaged, tested, cooled, and integrated into a working system. Advanced semiconductors are not magical pieces of silicon floating in space. They're industrial products moving through dozens of specialized bottlenecks. China understood that earlier than many analysts did. So while Washington focused heavily on leading-edge fabrication, the 5-nanometer and 3-nanometer race dominated by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and Samsung Electronics, Beijing expanded relationships across the lower visibility layers underneath. Malaysian firms gained Chinese investment. Singapore became increasingly important for semiconductor financing, transit, and regional headquarters operations. Vietnam saw rapid electronics manufacturing expansion tied to both Chinese and Western firms simultaneously. That simultaneously part matters because Vietnam is not choosing China over America. Malaysia is not choosing America over China. Most countries in this network are choosing access. Access to markets, access to capital, access to technology flows from both directions, which means they resist pressure from either side when that pressure threatens growth. People often frame the semiconductor conflict like a chessboard. It's closer to an airport during a storm. Flights get rerouted constantly. One underreported example came through Central Asia after the 2022 export restrictions. Trade data from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan showed unusual spikes in electronics-related imports and re-exports linked to China and Russia. Not necessarily illegal by default, but enough to trigger concern inside Western enforcement agencies. The U.S. Treasury and Commerce Department eventually started warning companies about transshipment risks through intermediary states. That word, transshipment, sounds technical and boring. It's actually the entire story, because sanctions only function cleanly when the rest of the world cooperates enthusiastically. And most countries don't see semiconductor trade through ideological lenses. They see factories, employment, export revenue, and leverage. If a country can position itself as an indispensable middle node between China and the West, it gains strategic importance overnight. The UAE figured this out quickly. Over the last several years, Abu Dhabi and Dubai expanded ambitions around advanced manufacturing, AI infrastructure, and logistics integration. Chinese technology firms increased their regional footprint there precisely because the Gulf offers something Beijing increasingly values: optionality. Neutral territory with money, ports, and political flexibility. Optionality is one of those words policymakers use when they mean backup plan, and China has been collecting backup plans everywhere. Indonesia became critical for nickel processing tied to battery and electronics supply chains. Thailand expanded electronics manufacturing capacity. Saudi Arabia pursued semiconductor investment partnerships linked to Vision 2030 diversification plans. Even countries without advanced fabs became useful because modern chip ecosystems aren't built around one miracle factory anymore. They're built around resilient networks. That's the shift Washington partially missed. The old model assumed choke points stay fixed forever. Control lithography, control the future. But the more pressure applied to those choke points, the more incentive every surrounding country had to profit from helping China route around them. Not necessarily out of loyalty to Beijing, often just because there was money on the table. A lot of money. And here's where the story becomes uncomfortable for the United States. American strategy toward China increasingly depends on allied coordination. Japan restricting tools, the Netherlands restricting ASML exports, South Korea balancing carefully, Europe aligning selectively. But many of the countries emerging inside China's alternative semiconductor network are outside Washington's traditional alliance architecture entirely, meaning leverage weakens. Quietly at first, then all at once. Remember that opening contradiction? Sanctions coinciding with record equipment imports? Part of the answer lives here. China stopped treating the semiconductor war as a purely technological contest and started treating it as a global infrastructure problem instead. Different game, different map. And the most important piece of that map still hasn't entered the conversation yet. Remember that number from the beginning, 7. At first, it sounded almost arbitrary, just another geopolitical statistic floating around the semiconductor industry. But the longer you follow the trade routes, the investment patterns, the logistics agreements, the factory announcements, the stranger that number becomes. Because those 7 countries were never meant to function as a formal alliance. They function more like shock absorbers. Malaysia for packaging and testing, Vietnam for electronics manufacturing expansion, Singapore for financing, arbitration, and regional coordination, the UAE for logistics flexibility and commercial neutrality, Saudi Arabia for capital and AI infrastructure ambitions, Kazakhstan and broader Central Asian corridors for rerouted trade flows stretching around sanctions pressure. Individually, none of these relationships changes the global balance of power. Collectively, they reduce the probability that China can be technologically cornered in one clean move. That's the real strategy. And honestly, it's more sophisticated than people give it credit for, because Beijing isn't trying to build a perfectly independent semiconductor ecosystem overnight. That would be unrealistic. The goal appears to be something narrower: make disruption survivable. Those are different ambitions entirely. A lot of Western discussion still treats the chip conflict like a race to invent the single most advanced processor on Earth. Important, yes, but most modern economies don't run exclusively on bleeding-edge chips. Cars don't need 3-nanometer processors. Industrial robots don't. Telecom systems, appliances, factory equipment, military logistics systems. Huge portions of the world still depend on mature node semiconductors manufactured on older processes. China already dominates large parts of that industrial layer, which creates the reversal many policymakers quietly worry about. The semiconductor war may not ultimately be decided by who reaches the technological frontier first. It may be decided by which system keeps functioning under pressure the longest. Different contest. And pressure changes how countries think. Before 2022, China still behaved like a state deeply invested in preserving globalization exactly as it existed. After the export controls, the mindset visibly shifted. Efficiency stopped being the only objective. Redundancy suddenly mattered more. You can see it everywhere. Chinese semiconductor equipment imports surged even after restrictions tightened. Local governments poured money into domestic fabs despite repeated corruption scandals and failed projects. Universities expanded chip engineering programs aggressively. Companies like Huawei stopped acting purely like consumer tech brands and started behaving more like strategic national infrastructure. That transformation is important, because countries preparing for temporary tension behave differently from countries preparing for permanent technological competition. And I'm not fully convinced Washington understood how quickly China would accept the second possibility. To be fair, America still retains enormous advantages. Advanced lithography systems remain heavily controlled through ASML and allied export restrictions. U.S. firms dominate major sections of electronic design automation software. High-end AI accelerators still revolve around American ecosystems led by companies like NVIDIA. Those are real choke points. But choke points lose power if the targeted country becomes politically and economically resilient enough to tolerate the pain instead of reversing course. That's the uncomfortable possibility emerging here. China may not need technological equality with the United States in the near term. It may only need enough supply chain depth, enough regional integration, and enough alternative routing capacity to prevent sanctions from forcing strategic concessions later. That's a much lower threshold, and surrounding countries are increasingly helping build it, not because they necessarily support Beijing politically, but because semiconductor fragmentation creates opportunity. Factories move, transit hubs expand, investment floods into middle economies positioned between both sides. There's a dry kind of irony buried in all this. The harder the global technology system split into rival camps, the more valuable neutral intermediaries became. And neutral intermediaries rarely stay neutral for free. They invoice everybody. The strange thing about great power competition is that people usually notice the confrontation before they notice the infrastructure underneath it. Warships get attention, factory permits don't. Military exercises dominate headlines. Customs agreements between semiconductor firms and mid-sized Asian economies do not. But history has a habit of rewarding the side that builds quietly while everyone else argues loudly. And I think that's the real lesson sitting underneath this entire semiconductor story. For the last few years, the global conversation around China and chips became emotionally attached to Taiwan. Almost every debate collapsed into the same question: what happens if the Taiwan Strait crisis explodes? Fair question. Taiwan still matters enormously. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company remains one of the most important industrial companies on Earth. But while attention stayed locked there, China appears to have been solving a different problem in parallel. What if access becomes uncertain long before any military conflict begins? That's the scenario Beijing increasingly seems focused on. Not dramatic invasion headlines, slow technological pressure, export restrictions tightening year after year, access narrowing gradually, insurance against isolation becoming more valuable than pure efficiency. And once you see the strategy through that lens, the deals with those 7 countries stop looking secondary. They become the foundation, not a replacement for high-end semiconductor independence. China still has weaknesses, serious ones. Advanced lithography remains a problem. Certain AI chips remain difficult to replace. American and allied firms still control critical layers of the ecosystem. But the broader trajectory matters more than any single weakness, because supply chains have momentum. Once factories open, workers train, logistics routes stabilize, and governments begin collecting revenue from those systems, reversing the process becomes politically expensive. Countries start protecting the arrangement even when pressure arrives from larger powers. That's already happening quietly across parts of Southeast Asia and the Gulf. Nobody wants to choose sides publicly. Almost everybody wants to profit privately. And honestly, I think Washington underestimated how many countries would prefer that balancing strategy instead of joining a fully coordinated containment architecture. The American assumption was that enough allied pressure could isolate China technologically over time. The reality looks messier, more negotiated, more porous. A system where restrictions slow China down, sometimes significantly, but don't fully stop the larger regional integration process already underway. That's a very different outcome from total technological isolation. There's also a deeper economic consequence ordinary people will eventually feel. A fragmented semiconductor world is almost certainly a more expensive one. Duplicate factories, redundant supply chains, politicized sourcing decisions, higher insurance costs, strategic stockpiling. All of that raises the price of the invisible systems underneath modern life. Cars, electronics, cloud infrastructure, AI services, even household appliances. The age of hyper-efficient globalization may already be ending in slow motion, not collapsing overnight, just quietly becoming less efficient each year. My own view? I don't think the United States can fully reverse this trend now. Slow it down, yes. Protect critical technological leads, probably. But the broader diversification has already started. Too many countries discovered there's money and leverage in becoming semiconductor middle ground between Washington and Beijing. And once governments taste strategic relevance, they rarely volunteer to become irrelevant again. That's why this story matters beyond chips. It's really about the emergence of a more fragmented world economy, one where countries no longer trust critical systems to remain politically neutral forever. China understood that early and responded by spreading risk outward across multiple states before the pressure intensified further. Quietly, methodically, almost boringly, which is usually how the biggest shifts begin. And there's one final irony sitting at the center of all this. America spent years warning the world that overdependence on China was dangerous. A growing number of countries heard the warning, then decided dependence on both sides might be even more profitable. That's not ideology. That's business. If you want more breakdowns like this, the kind that follow the infrastructure underneath the headlines instead of the headlines themselves, you know where to find me.